In my world there is music and good vibes and laughter and lovers, adventure and friendship. We know who we are.
Hello and welcome everybody to Be the Wellness Podcast. Adam and Vanessa Lambert. Guess what we're doing?
Dun, dun, dun.
We're podcasting.
Surprise. Yes, we are podcasting, and it was an awesome day of podcasts today.
That's true.
Yeah, we had some really awesome guests, and we were lucky enough we got to actually be hosted first thing this morning by Kevin Geary at Rebooted Body.
Yep.
So we'll be over there on his podcast as well. So if you haven't had a chance, make sure you go check that out. Listen to our episode over there. Kevin's got a really great no-nonsense kind of very direct sort of no BS point of view on this whole health and fitness thing that we tend to really resonate with because it's just, you know, he's just saying all the things.
He's right.
He's right. He's basically right.
So it's cool. So you can go listen to us tell each other how right we are.
Exactly.
You're so right. No, you guys are so right.
You're right.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But first, let's talk about, we just did an awesome giveaway. And obviously this episode comes out a couple of weeks after we did this, but we ran a little contest for podcast reviews.
Yes.
And we got some really great reviews.
Yeah.
And it was really exciting. And, you know, we obviously have been asking for reviews and we had to step up the game and, you know,
Give some stuff away.
Which we're going to be planning to do more of because, you know, we get it. Like, we all need incentives. It's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've got cool stuff that we can give away.
We do, yes. Yeah. So we will be doing more of that, more incentivizing you guys to get out there and leave a podcast review and subscribe to Be the Wellness. But if you don't need an incentive, why delay? Yeah. Head on over and just put those 5 stars in there with some special comment next to Power Ranger 43, and we will be excited to see it.
Yeah. Yeah. You know that guy.
Yes.
So today. We had an opportunity to talk to, well, all right. So this is one of those things, right? Oh, this is my favorite podcast. You know, my favorite guest. It's the most interesting topic, blah, 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 blah. But for real, this, I think, the neurosculpting it's an interesting word, right? You say neurosculpting and people are like, what? Yes. And myself included. Mm-hmm. And today we are going to talk to someone who has put together a very succinct and doable way to neurosculpt.
Yes. Yeah, totally. And Lisa Wimberger is the founder and creator of the Neurosculpting Institute out of Denver, Colorado. And she's got a really great story. And, you know, I think honestly, we just all keep looking for these pieces to kind of get things to go more in the direction of the way we want to live our lives. And it was actually pretty interesting because this podcast came for us personally where we'd had a couple stressful days, you know, and I think like we have so many tools and we've been working so long at balancing our emotions and our energy and, you know, but at the same time, like sometimes life just gets stressful. Sometimes, you know, you've got a lot going on, you feel overwhelmed, like those things are just real. And so it was really cool to have this podcast at the time where we were kind of like in the middle of our own little like, you know, stress bubble. And it was like, oh, this is great. This is like another reminder of the practice of how we can change our state of mind and the way that it can apply not only to our physical experience, but our emotional and even sort of experience at manifesting what it is that we want to create in our lives.
Right. Yeah. And this, you know, there's a lot of ways of getting at this stuff, you know, and I think that this is it's a fresh perspective. And there was actually some ideas in here that I hadn't had before or hadn't heard before, you know, and she's got a lot going on. So it's super cool. Yeah. I feel like I learned a lot from this podcast and I'm going to dive a little deeper.
Yes.
And hopefully you all will too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this was the first time I've listened to a thought leader, or heard about a program or something that I'm like, actually, I think I want to get certified in this.
Yeah.
Which doesn't happen. I mean, I often, I know there's so many programs and things, but I actually get overwhelmed by all of that. I get overwhelmed by the amount of certificates and processes and all the things out there. But it's one of the few that I've been like, actually, I think I would like to know more about this.
Well, and I think, not to put words in your mouth, but part of the deal is very well articulated, and it's a plan.
It's a plan.
It's not it's like, here's how this is the system, and here's how you help people implement this system. It's not, super ethereal and like hard to drop a pin on,
Right.
So anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So I hope you guys enjoy this. And without further ado,
here's Lisa. And we're live. Welcome to the podcast, Lisa.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Yeah, we're really intrigued by this subject matter. And before we went live, I was telling you how interesting the book is. And this subject has come up a few times, this idea of neurosculpting in my world, in the coaching world. I've heard about it a few different times in for different applications. But I'm really excited to hear about it from your point of view. And so maybe just to get us started, you can give us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in this idea and this process of neurosculpting.
Yeah. So my educational background is that I have a master's in education, and I have various certificates in addition to that do not equate to degrees, but I have certificates of completion in medical neuroscience, in neurobiology, in visual perception in the brain, in neurons, synapses, things like that. And really the whole drive and interest in how to sculpt our brain patterns came because I have a history since the age of 15 of grand mal vasovagal tonic seizures. Which is a big, long way to say I would seize. And after determining many, many years after the onset, determining I was not epileptic, because I don't have cortical epileptic patterns, they kind of just told me that I had this hyperactive cranial nerve that was really triggered by stress. So what I had to do was kind of, long story short, take my lifelong meditation practice and turn it on its head and realize, wait a minute, I have a lifelong meditation practice that is not dealing with my stress, so much so that I have a stress disorder. Something's wrong. Maybe I should research what this vasovagal thing is. So that's where I went down the road of neuroscience, mostly for self-preservation, mostly to figure out how to heal myself. And the result of my inquiry into trying to understand my own brain led me to figuring out a process based on everything I was learning about neuroplasticity, led me to figure out a process, use it on myself like I was a guinea pig, and literally interrupt my seizure patterns to the point where I don't have seizures anymore. I could literally interrupt a seizure with this process and entrain myself to have a different response to an onset in the future. And that's exactly what happened. Once that worked for me, I basically quit my job in the corporate world. And I said, I have to bring these tools to people in trauma because it worked on an autonomic level for me. It worked to give my autonomic nervous system a completely different response to a seizure onset. That was powerful. That was so powerful that it literally changed the direction of my life. It literally saved my life because my seizures would stop my heart. I would have bradycardia and go into cardiac, not arrest, but the heart would stop.
Yeah.
And so this literally saved my life, and I needed to then do my due diligence and devote my life to spreading it. And that's what I did. And that was 11 years ago. So I'm a user and a practitioner of this process. And that's the only reason I can share it authentically.
One thing I do want to fold in early on here is in the book, you talk about the first seizure you had, and you met this spirit force called Zahara. And this really struck me because I've known folks who have had seizures. I've known folks who've had epilepsy. And this was the first time I'd ever read someone talking about the spiritual sort of component to these episodes. And so I want to make sure that we weave this in early on as you start to talk about your experience, that there was certainly a spiritual component to what you were experiencing in these seizures. And maybe you can just, as you tell us about, sort of how you're unfolding your journey towards becoming more interested in the neurosculpting side of it, you can also talk about the spiritual side of it and how you learn to bring those two along together.
Absolutely. For me, every single seizure came with, some people might call it hallucination. I call it it's almost like a parallel consciousness. So let me just frame my kinds of seizures for your audience, and then we can go into the process. Every seizure is different. Every person experiences something different. There are the kind of seizures where you're awake and conscious, you just lose a moment in time. And then there are grand mal seizures where you're completely unconscious, and some of them are tonic, where you're rigid and frozen, and others are convulsive. In my case, because my blood pressure would drop so radically, my heart would stop, and then I would get deprived of oxygen in the brain. So what happened was in theory, in practice actually, my consciousness would shut off. But to me, it never felt like that. So there would be, imagine you're seeing the edit in a film that is not seamlessly transitioned. It's a glitch. You actually just saw the glitch, but you don't know what it is. That's what would happen to me. So I would be present. I would get a halo. And for me, the halo was my stomach would drop out. I would suddenly feel a tunnel vision. I'd suddenly feel like, I don't know, maybe I need to throw up. I'm not sure. And then the glitch would happen in my consciousness as though I were watching that scene. But then I never perceived I lost consciousness. My body lost consciousness, but my mind picked up from that glitch and kept going, but it often went in a very different direction. So I'm going to give you a perfect example of how this works. Now, in my first seizure, I met Zahara, who was this being. And so I was at the counter in the bathroom. The world started to go into tunnel vision. And the next thing I know, I am with her. I don't know I've fallen on the ground. I don't know I'm laying on the bathroom floor. I'm with her. And I'm having a journey with her that's fully visceral. So visceral to the point that my seizure episodes are embedded as actual memories, even though I know they never happened. So I want to tell you how this works, because it does lead into the process. When I had a really bad one in front of my daughter, she was 3, and I had a seizure in a food court, and I was out for the duration till the paramedics came and were working on me. And the minute my stomach dropped out at that food court, I perceived what happened was I went, uh-oh, I just bit hard into this chicken bone. I think my tooth is loose. I don't feel good. I think I'm bleeding. Let me go to the bathroom. I grabbed my daughter's hand. We walked to the bathroom. I remember the walk to the bathroom. I remember being in the bathroom, looking in the mirror, wiggling my loose tooth, tasting blood down the back of my throat. I remember seeing her in my periphery and thinking I have to stay calm for her. And I remember scrolling through a list of dentists in my mind to see who could fix my lost tooth. None of that happened. Wow. What happened was I bit into a chicken bone and I had a seizure and I was out. I smashed into the table, I flipped over backwards, and I stopped breathing. None of that happened. But if you would put me into, let's say, a hypnotic memory recall, I would tell you the memory I just told you. I've tasted it. I've felt it. And it's more real than some memories I've actually experienced real time. So for me, there was some profound experiences happening that I couldn't ignore because they were as real as anything else in my life. So how could I ignore them? So So what often happened in those episodes was that I would be with people who would give me information or coaching or lead me to a perception that could help me down the road. So when I first met Zahara in the first seizure I ever had, she told me that we were more than these little bodies. She told me that we were functioning in the universe the way neurons function with each other, that we have to network with each other to, connect and function as a whole being. Like, she gave me the first insights that when I came out of the seizure were breadcrumb trails of things I would study, of roads I'd go down, perceptions I'd want to cultivate because they applied so specifically to my life. So for me, these seizures were gifts. I didn't think of it like that at the time, but in retrospect, they were. They informed me. They showed me the miraculous fiction of memory. Mm-hmm. And that was critical. That was critical for me to have an experience of, because our brains fabricate our experiences in so many ways. It's unbelievable. And neuroplasticity proves it. It shows it. Neuroscience has discovered that all of our memories, i.e. the things we feel are our history, the patterns we are driven from, the conscious and the subconscious patterns and responses to the world, a good chunk of that is fabrication. And so knowing my experience, that none of this really would be happening, yet it was the most embedded memories I had, proved to me I can make up anything. I could make up and believe anything just like everyone else in the world can. So when it got to learning neuroscience, I used this firsthand experience of fabricated reality as an incentive to look at, okay, what was the pattern of stress response that I created that would trigger that seizure? So the doctors told me, you don't have epilepsy, you're vasovagal. Stress will induce a seizure. So clearly there's a pattern that exists in response to stress that signals me to seize. It's a subconscious pattern. I didn't have a word for it. I didn't have a name for it. I didn't even know what it was. I just knew there's an interface between stress and my response. And the brain converts everything into patterns. So there's a pattern there. And that pattern may likely be a glitch in my central nervous system. It might be a chemical glitch, but it also might be an emotional glitch. And I have influence over my memories. It's been proven to me. I make them up. You make them up. So what if I could go strategically to whatever pattern that was that says, when you're stressed, these are the responses you should have? What if I could go squish myself somewhere in between the trigger and the response and start reworking the pattern? Because it might very well have been fabricated in the first place.
Yeah. So there's a little piece here that keeps jumping out to me that, there's so many pieces, but the one thing that I keep thinking about as you're talking is, so you're talking about how you have this memory of this recollection of something that didn't actually happen. And you use the words, and I made this up. But is it you that really made this up? So this is where I'm kind of almost diving into like a free will story. Like, who's actually making it up though? Is it you? Or is it something else making up the story? Because like I'm almost grappling with, like, does this actually make you feel like we actually have more free will over ourselves or less free will? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. In fact, I cover that exact question in the book. Okay. And here's what fascinates me about this. Neuroscience, some neuroscientists say the way the brain works proves we do not have free will. I'll give you an example. In the book Incognito, written by David Eagleman from Baylor College, he teaches there. He wrote the book Incognito, which was fascinating. And in that book, there's a section where it talks about free will and how it's been measured that fractions of a second before you have a recognizable desire for something, your neural networks are already firing, causing you to move in that direction. So for instance, you see a piece of cake and you're like, oh my God, I want that cake. Before you feel like you want the cake at a neurological level, your neurons are firing in the direction of probably even moving your hand towards the cake. So they use this as a reason to say, see, we don't have free will. It's all patterned and generated, and your consciousness, which thinks it's the one making the decision, is actually last to know. And I took this information and I said, you know what? BS. That is such BS for me personally, because I've been to the spirit world in these episodes and I've gotten information that changed the direction of my patterns in my life. Therefore, there's a source of information and incentive out there that is beyond the body. So what if that little equation of, well, action potential fires faster than conscious thought proves we don't have free will? What if there's a piece of the equation missing? And that piece of the equation is, but spirit is influencing the action potentials that fire before conscious thought. What if spirit information comes first? And nobody's been talking about that in science, of course, because it's not empirical. You can't prove it. And it's not a pill that scientists are ready to swallow, and that's fine. But in my experience, those two worlds were inextricably linked. And I had to not discount the fact that, so what, my patterns generate these impulses, but what is my spirit guiding me to do? I have a purpose in this body, and my spirit is not measurable to science at this point, but it is absolutely guiding me, because in the spirit realm, whenever I would go there, that information was directly relevant to my life, to my future, to my well-being, and literally at this point, to the thousands of people that neurosculpting has helped. So I know science would call that anecdotal, but until they have tools to measure that which is anecdotal, I'm still going to forge ahead and help people with this.
Right. Well, there always has to be someone on the lead edge, right? There has to be someone who anecdotally knows that this is true because you've experienced it as such. And, I think a lot of us live our lives that way. It's like sometimes science is just, most of the time science is way behind the curve. We're waiting for it to catch up to what we anecdotally already know. And I think that that's why this book is so interesting to me, is that you're walking this line of science and spirit that is a real gray area. It's like you have to make you have to make these leaps of faith to kind of bridge the gap between the thought experiments that you're doing. So I really appreciate that. And I think this is such an exciting conversation for that. So maybe with that, you can tell us a little bit about when you realized that these pieces of information that you were getting and that these experiences were actually a gift of sorts, and talk about the discovery and how you went from, this is happening to me to maybe this is happening for me.
Yeah. It actually, I switched my mindset to the, this is a gift kind of mentality far into the process. So I started having the seizures at 15. I didn't get my explanation or diagnosis till I was 30 that they were vasovagal seizures. And so the diagnosis, the label I got actually helped me, because the label I got caused me to research what the doctor said was happening to me. And it's through that research that a lot of my visions got validated, and I found a nameable approach, and I started piecing together a scaffolding or a structure or process, so to speak, that I could dive into my brain. So that's where I started thinking, maybe this is a gift. Before that, I was full of shame. I didn't tell people about these. Unless you were there to see it and witness it, which some of my friends were, you were not going to hear about it from me. I hid that I had these episodes. My parents had only heard about them from one or two people who saw me when I was a young teenager have a seizure. They had never seen one themselves. Often they would happen. I would get home from school about a couple hours before my parents got home. So a lot of times they happened in the bathroom after school, and I'd crawl myself to bed before they got home. So it was not a gift in my mind until I had a label and something I could sink my teeth into to start problem solving. That's when it turned to the gift. And that perspective of, oh, I have a starting point, helped me find a little launch pad into research. And so where some people might feel limited by a label, it actually liberated me. And of course, the balance is, do you become victim to that label, or do you use it to empower you? And I chose to use it to empower me. I chose to use it as a starting point and say, I'm going to drop the label very soon. Like, I'm not going to hold this for a long time. I'm going to hold it long enough to do the research. And then I'm getting rid of that label. And then it will not exist for me. And that's kind of how I used it, as framing it as a gift. Although I always knew, even when I didn't perceive it as a gift, I always knew those episodes and that those experiences were important. I just couldn't decipher them yet. At the time, when I was younger, I'm reading Carlos Castaneda. I'm reading, shamanic literature. I'm going on shamanic journeys. I'm doing all of this mysticism and energetics work, which made me feel like those visions meant something, but I didn't have any real way to decipher them. I didn't get grounded with any of this until science, honestly.
That's interesting, because it's like, it almost seems like that's counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
That, you start off in this place, but I think that it's not actually that unique of an experience. I think that, like, we've certainly talked to quite a few people, and this has been, I have a similar experience myself, where you start down a path of trying to understand the nature of things, right? And some people start with science, and some people start more in the spiritual realm. And, maybe in grade school and high school and stuff, you get, your life sciences or whatever, but then you embark on this more, spiritual inquisition into what's going on. But I think, I've shared a very similar experience in that science took me so far, with my understanding of things. And then I kind of had to go into a little bit more of the spiritual realm to have a little deeper understanding of how I interact with that science. And then now, like what you're saying is, you get that little piece of knowledge, and then now all of a sudden the science that exists and is just, there's so much coming out now, especially, around the brain and just how the general workings of things go. Now you have a new anchor point for where you can get in and say, okay, now I can reconcile these two things. So to me, it makes all the sense in the world that you would get so much clarity out of a sort of mechanistic diagnosis. Like, this is how this is happening for you, and this is what science currently thinks about it, but at least it's a place for you to go and explore.
I liken it to the hemispheres of the brain. So we've all taken those silly, are you a left brainer or a right brainer kind of tests, right? Okay, so there's a lot of assumption in those, and I'm sure science does not approve of those tests as the empirical data, but they are based in brain function archetypes. So let me give you an example. We are in our left brain language centers. We are processing and communicating information that is very semantic based, literal, sequenced in time progression, past, present, future, concrete, detailed understanding that is absolutely functioning, represented by the left front and back language centers. So a left hemisphere kind of dominance really values empirical data. It understands it, and it wants to communicate with it. Our right brain language centers do not function like that. They govern the input and output of implied meaning, symbolic meaning, the meaning behind the words, the tone, the prosody of our voice, the body gestures, and everything that can't have a word or a label, but that rounds out the communication. So if I look at those of us who are mystics, right, and don't have room for science, then I compare that to those of us who might only be living in our right brain language centers, only interested in the symbology behind the things. Mm-hmm. And then those of us who are science-minded, I liken that to, what if we only lived in our left brain language centers? I wouldn't understand the implied meaning behind the tone you use when you choose to say I love you. I would just understand the words and how they're defined. So for me, I almost think some of us need to go from one extreme to the other to find a communication point in the middle that is a whole brained approach, a whole spirited approach. So I had to start with mysticism and deny science vehemently. Vehemently as a child. I had to, argue at the dinner table where my father said, prove it. I said, no, just believe it. And then, right?
No, you prove it.
No, I'm not going to prove it because I have faith, right? And then when I got older, all I wanted to do was prove it, right? So until I could marry the mystical side of me, the spiritual scale, with the driven data of this body world experience, until I could marry those two things, I was in a silo on one side or the other. Just like we have two hemispheres of the brain. Do you really want to use half a brain? If you had a choice to use both sides in partnership with each other, if you could equally reach for the implied meaning and the symbology of something and equally give it words and definitions so that you could communicate even more about the world you're experiencing, isn't that a richer experience? And so for me, I absolutely was imbalanced when I was just in my mystical studies. And I would have been equally imbalanced if I was only in my scientific studies. I had to get those two things talking to each other because they're saying the same thing. They're saying the same thing.
Yeah, I think people tend to start to take on an identity, right? Like you were talking about someone who's more right brain or left brain. And I think we are sort of socialized into defining who we are at some point. Like, oh, I have to say, oh, I'm a right brain person or I'm a left brain person. And I think we kind of get conditioned into claiming ourselves in one camp or another. And what I love about this is that you're saying it's time to bring the camps together. It's time that we really acknowledge that these two things can paint a richer photo or a richer canvas of what's happening in our life. And I love that. So maybe you can actually talk about neurosculpting and maybe just start with simply, what is neurosculpting?
Yeah. So neurosculpting is a 5-step process that feels a lot like, it can feel a lot like creative visualization or meditation or hypnosis kind of. It's a mental entrainment process. It involves 5 steps of teasing the brain in different ways. The first step of neurosculpting is to quiet our stress center through teasing a focused awareness to all things that make that part of the brain get quiet, to tease it towards safety and predictability and consistency and familiarity. You can actually quiet your midbrain pretty quickly if you just start looking around your space and saying, I'm dry, I'm warm, I'm safe, I have access to a bathroom. Oh, I'm breathing, this is good. You make your checklist, you give it to the brain, and the brain responds to it. And so if we can quiet the midbrain as the first step, what actually can start to happen is that the central nervous system begins to believe it is approaching safety, which means your physiology is going to change. You're going to quiet down activity in the midbrain. You're going to start shunting resources like blood oxygen and glucose to the front of the brain. You're going to start shunting blood oxygen and glucose back to the midline of the body. So your muscles will soften. You'll start using blood. You start processing blood sugar differently. Your insulin production will change. Your inflammation will go down. Real measurable changes happen when you tease the midbrain into a state of quieter than it was before. So that's step one. When we do step one and we've started to shift our physiology, what science showed us is that if we have resources available more in the front of the brain at this point, we actually are highly entrainable, meaning we're primed to learn and remember. But more importantly, we're primed to learn and remember while fear is quiet. And that's important because fear is a fantastic neuroplastic learner. We don't want that at this point. We want to minimize that and amplify other neuroplastic enhancements like the front of the brain. So we do step two, we anchor in to an entrainment in the front of the brain. We anchor into all the things science now tells us sparks the front of the brain: curiosity, creativity, wonder, novelty, humor. So after we feed the checklist to the midbrain to get it quiet, we feed a checklist to the front of the brain to get it active. We start imagining interesting shapes and colors we've never seen before. We start imagining anything that makes our brain say, ooh, that's interesting. And this simple checklist of introducing novel thoughts now sets a stage, an induced brain state. That induced brain state is quiet midbrain, active front brain. And that means we have a platform to entrain something. Whatever that thing is, our brain is ready to buy it, more so than it would before. So what do we want the brain to believe at this point? Now, in my case, after this two-step induction, I wanted my brain to pull that pattern that was the response pattern to my seizure trigger, and I wanted to file down the sharp edges of that nasty pattern so it wouldn't hijack me anymore. I had to first entrain my brain to a heightened state of believability and suggestibility in order to do that. And that's what the induction did. At that point, in step three, after you've induced your brain, you can edit a story. You can edit a pattern. You can entrain to a brand new pattern that's never even existed. And you have to do it with lots of focused attention. So for me, I would draw to mind the moment that seizure onset would start, and I would start rehearsing a different response in my mind. So I've induced my brain, and now I go into a rehearsal. I'm an actress in a play, and I'm going to imagine that seizure halo and what it felt like. And now I'm going to engage both sides of my brain for a super rich investment in this new story. And the new story is, I'm going to give some words and descriptions to what my body is about to do. I'm going to give some colors and vibrations and implied symbology. So I'm getting both sides of my brain involved in this creation story. And I'm going to create the story of fighting this onset instead of seizing. So I literally rehearsed fighting my seizure. I rehearsed screaming at it, biting it, kicking it, punching it, so that it was anything but seize. And I rehearsed it so much with such a focus on getting both my left brain and right brain language centers involved that more of my brain participated in this story. So the brain valued this more importantly. And then I rehearsed it over and over and over again. And every time I successfully rehearsed a new response to my seizure, I wanted to anchor that in my body. And then step 4 of neurosculpting is you find what your body is doing in this moment. If I just made an edit and I feel a little tingle in my gut, I want to know. I want to remember that. I want to observe it. And then I put my hand there. And this somatic experience of putting my hand where my body is saying yes to the edit is going to help me remember it tomorrow because I'm going to put my hand again there tomorrow. So I'm going to keep recalling that in real time and visceral experience with my hand gesture. And then in step 5 of the process, I would give it a word. I'd give a word to that experience. So now I have a linguistic trigger, a hand gesture trigger to an edit I've made. Now, this 5-step process of steps 1 and 2, inducing the brain, step 3, crafting a new story or editing an old one, step 4, marking it in your body, step 5, marking it with a linguistic cue. This sequence I had to repeat for months. I went into meditation for months, playing with this sequence, rehearsing and rehearsing and rehearsing a new response to a seizure. And it doesn't happen overnight. And I didn't know if it would work, but I can tell you after months of rehearsing it, I got a seizure halo and it came and I did my regular, like I'm going to have a seizure. And the rehearsal script I had been rehearsing for the 9 months before kicked in. And suddenly, without control, I was punching and kicking and screaming in the car where I would normally have a tonic seizure. And I never had another seizure since. I've had halos, but the halos go away because now the response is different. I haven't seized since. So this was, I mean, it's a kind of convoluted explanation to what you asked, but the bottom line is I played with a sequencing of what my brain needed in order to believe it could change the pattern in the first place. I had to induce it. I had to reinforce a new story. I had to mark it in my body, and I had to give myself access to rehearse that script in real time, not just in meditation, but in real time by putting my hand on those body parts or thinking of those words. I needed every associative way in to that experience so that I could enrich it with each meditation, but also reinforce it every single day with some association and reference. Kind of like, you know, if you met someone once and his name was George and you just said the word George for the rest of your life, do you think you'd forget who you met? I don't think so. Right? Okay.
Yeah.
So that's what you do. You create this visceral experience and you give it associations. And then in real time, you repeat those associations. Do you actually re-meet George every day just because you say his name? No, you certainly don't. But do you forget him? No, you don't. And to the brain, if it's memorable and stored in memory, it is high value, which means you absolutely can access it and make it stronger. So neurosculpting gives us opportunities to load in trigger points into the meditations so that we don't forget those meditations in our day-to-day, that we reinforce them subconsciously over and over again so that the next time we go into a meditation to do it in a rich meditative environment, it's even more visceral.
Absolutely. So first of all, there's a couple different questions I have here, but first, can you just give me like an overarching compass of the kinds of things that this could be loaded into? I mean, obviously we're talking about seizures, but give me some examples of other things that this can be loaded into effect.
Yeah. So at this point, we have thousands of students, and each of our students uses this for different applications. So for instance, when, and we can get back to law enforcement later, but when I teach this to officers, they're applying this to help them discharge their stress patterns so that they can start each day without accumulated stress from the day before. Okay, so stress patterns in general. We have students who apply this to addictions. How do I soften the story and the pattern of my addiction cycle? And we have people who are addicted to, and we have students who have successfully applied this to addictions to heroin, OxyContin, and alcohol, and Ritalin. There are students who use this to help support them getting out of depressive patterns, anxiety patterns. We have the whole physiological spectrum. So we have students who use this. We have spinal cord injury students who are using this to re-entrain to the patterns of movement and literally getting movement back in limbs that in theory should be paralyzed. We have students with MS who have been using this during inflammation to calm down their inflammation so the MS gets mitigated. We have students, traumatic brain injury students, who have used these to repattern after some pretty severe traumatic brain injury and acclimate faster. Eating disorders, everything we do is the result of an efficiency created by a brain pattern. Everything.
And I've heard the application for allergies, like food allergies and even environmental toxins and allergies. Correct? Am I correct in
there? We do have a couple students who have high toxicity, high hypersensitivity in those cases, and they have used this. My thought around that is, so there's a theory that if you're severely traumatized in a chronic way, that a lot of those early childhood traumas result in hypertoxic sensitivity later on. So that if you are experiencing, you're sensitive to all sorts of smells and environmental toxins and things like that. Now, there could be a million reasons for that, but one of the reasons that also could be present is that you have been entrained. You've entrained almost like your chemoreceptors to be seeking out danger. And so to repattern the perception of seeking out danger can sometimes mitigate those kinds of sensitivities. Of course, there's no science behind that, but there are my students who have done it. So we do have some students who have done that.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the most interesting applications. And we've had a couple of clients who've talked about doing that and had great success with it.
Yeah. Well, when you think about, the immune system being fundamentally in charge of a lot of things when it comes to, our perception of our health, right? So, I mean, that's how we know we're not well, is our immune system's doing something and making us feel it, right? For the most part, there's some piece of that. So if like, why wouldn't it work? Like if we're talking about fundamentally driving a wedge in the gap between what your body perceives as happening and what's maybe actually happening.
You just gave my key phrase. You gave my key phrase as well. Why wouldn't it work? And so when people come to me and say, "Can we use neurosculpting for this?" My answer is, "I don't know. Let's try."
Right.
And if it doesn't work, then we know it didn't work for you. But in the meanwhile, I never tell people to stop what they're already. I never tell people stop your therapy, stop your meds. Nothing like. I'm not a doctor, so I don't even go there. But what my answer is, I don't know. How about we try it? And that just even having the inquisitive curiosity around, let's see what we can do here. There is undoubtedly 100% of the time a mental, emotional, and physical component to all issues we are experiencing as humans.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't we want to try to get into the mental and the emotional side of things to try to help with whatever might be physiologically incited or chemically induced. It's a holistic opportunity here,
right,
to go in and try to support people,
right. And that's probably something that we should hover on for a second, because I mean, in our world where we deal in a lot of nutrition stuff, but we bring in, if somebody wants to, I want to fix my diet, okay, well, that means a lot of different things to us. What I mean? There's going to be food, there's going to be a mindfulness practice, there's going to be movement, there's going to be your relationships with, right? So it's this holistic concept, and it's like the more and more that we dig in, like at the broader scientific level to everything, we're finding out that everything's holistic, and which it's perfectly obvious if you can just back up, a little ways and look at everything. You're like, how would we ever anticipate that these things wouldn't be connected? That these cause and effect relationships of, taking a drug to affect this system and the side effects that come along with it. Like on the day-to-day level, we acknowledge that all of this stuff is connected just in that relationship. Well, I take this medication and the side effects are blah, 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 blah. people, so there's an underlying understanding that it's all connected. But then when you try to tell somebody, well, these things are all connected, so why don't we work on this? They're like, it's crazy. So
I know it's so counterintuitive, yet it's what we've all accepted as a society, is that if something's wrong with your heart, you take a heart medication. If something's wrong with your gut, you look at just the gut. If something's wrong with your mind, you take SSRIs. Now, all of these things are great supports, but your gut and your mind are connected.
Right.
Your heart's part of the whole system. Your heart's governed by what the gut and the mind are actually doing, and how the vagus nerve is telling your heart rate to increase or decrease. I mean, there's the fact that we have taken one organic body and siloed and separated it into all its vast parts and pieces. Right. And those are the little things we look at, is just, it's like cutting a flower stem 75%. And the flower flops over and the head of the flower dies. And you're looking at the head going, I don't know why it's wilted. Mm-hmm. Because you just cut the stem.
Right.
It's like a unit.
Right.
So it's interesting because you just said something that's like, I don't know. Well, you've said a couple things here that are I'm going to try to tie together without stammering too much. So because you just were talking about the individual silos of the body, and it's something that we seem to be getting deeper and deeper into that. Like, and we'll just use like traditional Western medicine as an example, where everyone specializes because we know so much. It's like you can't be a person who knows everything about everything in the human body now because we know too much. There's too many of these sort of left-brained, for using the references we were talking about earlier, sort of left-brained analytical conceptual pieces to these individual silos. And so in order for someone to be a holistic doctor at this point, you would almost have to resign some of that left-brained silo-ness to a little more of the right-brained sort of conceptual ability to bring it all together as a whole. And we just don't, as a consumer of Western medicine, we don't really trust that yet. You go into somebody and you're like, hey, well, I mean, I know I'm not a cardiologist. I'm a general practitioner, but here's what I feel like is going on. And they're going to be like, well, what do you mean you feel? Like, feel is kind of a weird word for this. Right. So it's interesting.
Well, I almost think it's less about trying to get the one person to know all systems and more about getting all of the specialty people to learn how to talk to each other.
That's a good point. Yeah. Just that. Oh man, it's almost like if there was something that could like connect all of our computers together. It would be communication would be interesting. Yeah.
Oh man, what a great idea.
So I kind of want to take this in a different route because this concept kind of kept peeping over the fence at me as we were talking about this. And you're applying all of this to almost physical applications. But what kept kind of knocking at the door for me was, well, when you apply this, how does this actually influence the way you manifest your life? And let me see if I can try to give an example of this is, you're talking about how you're loading the brain and you're practicing these things. And a lot of these have to do with physical responses that we're talking about. But I'm actually curious about the application of loading yourself with responses to how your future will go, how you will be in your life, how things will work out. And, we're business owners. We're always pushing down the doors of what's possible. And with that comes a lot of stress and unknowingness. And, is this going to work out? Are we doing this right? So I'm wondering about the application to this almost at like a spiritual manifestation level.
It's interesting because we're actually just running a Manifesting Your Life's Goals class. And here's what I'm going to say. Okay, there are stories underneath stories underneath stories. And unless you have a vehicle to open and induce your brain to going to those underlayer stories and tweaking, editing, and examining them, then you stay at the surface level. So for instance, let's say, I'm going to give you an example. Years ago, I was trying to manifest more money. And I said, okay, universe, I'm ready for all the money I'm ready. Just bring it on. And I lost my contract and I was laid off. So all of a sudden I had no job to go to, no boss, and I didn't have to wake up to an alarm clock. And I went, gee, this law of attraction stuff sure doesn't work. What I just got the opposite, right? Okay, right. So then I did what I normally do in life is I go into meditation to examine what happened. And lo and behold, I pull up a memory. The memory of as a child going, when I'm rich, I'm not going to work for anybody and I'm never going to wake up to an alarm clock. And I said, oh, that was the actual story underneath the surface story, surface story was, I want more money. Mm-hmm. Universe gave me what it meant to my being, what it meant in my cells, what it meant to my subconscious. So this goes to how do you want to show up in life? So, we've got edges, we've got stories. If you have a process, a mental entrainment process that could go underneath them and start making more articulate and real and viscerally remembered to your body the actual meanings you want out of life, you're going to start recognizing those things when they come. You're going to start understanding you are manifesting. And then you're going to start manifesting with alignment and clarity, which looks like magic. Mm-hmm. But we have surface things that get in the way. And neurosculpting allows us to hone in on what is the meaning and the felt sense outcome. So what I do for my people who are like wanting this for self-help and self-development, mm-hmm. taking that money example again, if someone came to me and said, help me manifest more money with neurosculpting, I would say, okay, if you had all the money in the world, what would that feel like to you? Oh, I would have freedom over my time. I would be my own boss. I would have my own schedule. And then I would take them into a neurosculpting meditation and have them start evoking the experience and the associations with being their own boss and having the freedom. Where in your body do you already know that? What does that feel like? I'd start targeting their nervous system to the outcomes so they can stop asking for a mantra or a word or a thing and actually just start in training to cultivating the felt sense of the outcomes, because that cultivation of the felt sense allows us to then recognize it in real time when it happens. It's like, oh, I already know that feeling. I'm on the right path.
Right. And you hear this in the things when you hear people say things like, if you want this in your life, start being the kind of person who already has that. Right. And so that seems similar, where it's like you actually start to embody physically what it means to be that kind of person that has what it is you're asking for.
Right. The trick is, unless you have a process to get your contracted fight, flee, fear, skeptic, I don't believe this center to be quiet, you're not going to entrain to anything different. Mm-hmm. So there needs to be a strategic way to put those obstacles aside in order to actually entrain to it, which is why neurosculpting is so pragmatic, is because those first two steps take care of that.
Yeah.
Got it.
So I could see this being I'm anticipating like doing this in my own sort of left brain analytical self to help bring back to center, because I there's a tremendous amount of truth in what you're saying about needing to find that balance there. And I could see that this methodology is like, this speaks to me. So I'm curious, like if in your experience, if you find yourself working with predominantly, order and structure driven people, or if you have your fair share of art.
It is across the board. I have those ordered people come in, and we help them get in touch with what's underneath and what's fluid and the other side of that. And then we have the people who have no grounding at all, and we help them understand that order and structure doesn't have to be scary, and that they're just two sides. Either polarity is a proclamation of being half-brained.
Ooh, I love that. I love that.
So I just want to help that one side make room for the other and have them talk. And actually just neuroplastically, anytime we cross the midline, anytime we have crosstalk between the right and left hemisphere, we are enhancing the plasticity, the value of the moment. Just like if you want to learn how to play a sport, you have to counterbalance across the midline to do anything. So crossing the midline is critical. When it's in our body, we understand it, because the minute it's not there, we tip over, right? If you can't cross the midline and counterbalance, you're done. You're going to fall on your face. So it's evident in the body. It's not so evident in the mind, but the same principles hold. If you can cross the midline of the brain and bring a crosstalk communication for counterbalance, you've got skill. You've got balance. You've got capability and ability. And the minute you silo, you're going to tip over at some point, somewhere.
Yeah, I love this. So I know we're getting close to an hour here, but there was a piece of the book that stuck out to me, and I just want to kind of touch in on this. And you talk about doing some research in the laboratory of University of Colorado with doing experiments with plants. And the line in here that stuck out to me was that your own ideas around consciousness expanded, and I gained a greater reverence for all life after these experiences. What does that mean to you?
Well, for a long time, I've wrestled with the fact that I eat meat. I'm a carnivore.
Yes.
And of course,
I hope you would go here.
Yeah. Of course, I try to source my meat ethically, sustainably. And no, that is absolutely not always possible. That's the truth of it. And for many years, I've been beating myself up for eating meat. My body wants that protein, and right or wrong, that's what I do. And, but it wasn't until I started talking to the plants in the laboratory, where they were hooked up to a machine and I was hooked up to a machine, and every single mood swing of mine, their sine wave signature on the computer screen changed in sync with mine. And it wasn't until I felt like I was connected and communicating with them, and their sine wave signatures matched that in many, many experiences. You can read about it in the book. But it wasn't until then that I really understood, wow, if my perception of consciousness is that if I'm in a bad mood, I affect you, and if you're in a bad mood, you affect me, well, then I'm going to tell you plants are conscious. They're conscious to the point where they scream when someone they don't like walks in the room, according to the way these experiments have been run. If you pinch their leaf, their sine wave signature goes off the charts. They're not happy about you picking them. They're not happy about you cutting their leaves off. They're not happy about you chewing on them. And neither are animals. So with that said, I started viewing everything in this spectrum of equal consciousness. Just because they're not speaking my language, or animals are mooing instead of barking, it doesn't mean one's better than the other. And just because plants are not audible doesn't mean they're not screaming. So what am I going to eat? I don't know.
Right.
I'm going to have to eat. So what I choose to do is, before every meal, is I say a prayer to not only the rain and the sun and the earth and everything that grew that food, but every person that ever touched it, packaged it, moved it, every truck, every gasoline pump that brought that food to my door, every worker who pulled that out of the earth or cared for that, every animal that mothered that baby animal, everything goes into my prayer before I eat. And that's the only way I can eat.
Yeah. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Like it really is. And it's like, it's something that what's funny, I think Vanessa and I have tried to say that several times or something like it, but not even close to as articulate and like well put as that.
Yes.
But it's just interesting because, like, for me, this sort of and I hate to like couch this as a vegan argument, but this is usually where we hear it. This like argument around sentience has always just seemed super lazy to me. I'm like, how do you know? Like you're driving a stake in the ground saying that sentience stops here. And I'm like, how do you get to pick? You know what I mean? But then you see a sign that says, it's got a cow and a dog and a horse and a chicken or whatever. And it's like, where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
Which, like, well, keep chasing that all the way down to the microbes. You know what I mean? Like, where do you draw the line?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so everyone has to draw the line for themselves, and everyone has to settle into a way to eat that transmutes that process into something healthy for them.
Right.
Yes, well said. Thank you so
You're
much. And thank
welcome.
you for your time today.
Yes.
This has been so enlightening, and I feel like we just barely scratched the surface.
Yeah.
So I feel like people go get the book, check out, where can folks find you and your classes?
Yeah, they can find me at neurosculptinginstitute.com. We've got a huge online learning store, a live stream events calendar that you can tune in live, and then an in-person. If you're local to Colorado and you want to show up in person, we have monthly memberships where you're getting live sessions with me twice a month. It's endless. So please go to neurosculptinginstitute.com, click on the learning store, see what goodies are there for you, and also what freebies are there for you, because there's some free stuff, and contact us for a chance to dive in.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's awesome. We'll definitely have to have you back, because I think there's this, we provided a fantastic overview, I think, of what goes on. And I know that this conversation is going to spark a lot of communication and interest and back and forth within our community. So I guarantee we could drum up a bunch of questions and do like a Q&A, which would be pretty cool.
Would be very cool.
That sounds great. I always love to engage with the community, so that would be wonderful.
Awesome. Yeah, and we're planning on being out in Colorado later this year, so we'll have to look you up for sure.
Please do.
Yeah,
Please
awesome.
do.
Well, thanks again. This is Lisa Wimberger of Neurosculpting, a whole brain approach to heal trauma, rewrite limiting beliefs, and find wholeness. We'll see you soon. Bye. All right, folks, we hope you enjoyed that episode and that you will check out the Neurosculpting Institute for more information. And we hope that you will join us at B-Fest, which is going to be an incredible event that takes place in Northern California in the Redwood Forest. Mm-hmm. And we're taking over a really awesome location.
It's true.
We're throwing an awesome event.
We're making one big party.
Yeah, and there's only a few spaces left. So get into that event before it sells out and be part of this community, be part of this celebratory experience, and come learn some awesome stuff.
Yeah. The best place to find that whole thing is at bethewellness.com.
Yes.
You go to the retreats and adventures, and it's the number one right at the top, B-Fest. Can't miss it. Check it out. And if you have any questions about it, hit us up. info@bethewellness.com. Shoot us an email. Let's get these questions answered.
Yeah.
We don't want any barriers.
Absolutely. And, folks that are traveling, because I know a lot of times it seems like, oh, it's so far, but we've got folks coming from all over the world. So we're helping folks arrange shuttles and get dialed in to share rides and all that good stuff. So don't let that be a barrier for you. We can help connect you with groups that are coming in and get you lined out and part of the transportation. So no worries.
Yeah, totally. It's one of those things that I think it can seem like it's a really big task, and there's a lot of logistics and a lot of things in the way to go on a vacation anywhere. You know what I mean?
Definitely.
But like to do something like this, and we've been doing this for a while, and we've seen just about everything. So please just reach out. If there's anything you're like, oh, well, but they probably wouldn't do that. Hit us up.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're
we
nice.
like your problems. Your problems are our problems. All right, folks. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.